Lady Evelyn Hayes had perfected the art of being invisible. It was a skill born of necessity, honed in the drawing rooms and ballrooms where she was consistently overlooked. She was not a great beauty, nor was she a wit. She was simply the daughter of a baron whose lands and luck had long since run dry. Her existence was a quiet, grey thing, a life lived in the margins of other people's brighter, more vibrant stories. Today, however, she was painfully visible. She felt the weight of every stare, from the carriage driver to the stony-faced solicitor, Mr. Croft, who now sat opposite her. The air in the office was thick with the scent of old paper and sealing wax, a funereal smell that seemed entirely appropriate for the occasion. This was, after all, the death of her future, or rather, the official execution of a future she had never wanted in the first place. Her father had been ecstatic when the Duke of Blackwood's representatives had approached him. A betrothal to a duke. It was a salvation so profound, so utterly beyond the scope of their dwindling hopes that her father had wept. Evelyn had felt nothing but a cold, creeping dread. The Duke was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. A man of immense power and wealth, known for his ruthless efficiency in all matters, including, it seemed, the procurement of a wife. She was to be his duchess. The thought was a stone in her stomach. She knew her role, to be a pretty, silent accessory, to produce an heir, and to manage a household so vast it might as well have been a small country. She would be another of her father's assets, traded for financial security. The greyness of her life would simply be exchanged for the gilded bars of a more luxurious cage. But then the summons had come. Not to a tea, not to a stilted introductory meeting, but to his solicitor's office. Her father had been furious, seeing it as a slight. Evelyn had felt a flicker of something she dared not name. It felt like a reprieve. Across the polished mahogany desk, Mr. Croft cleared his throat, his eyes flicking nervously towards the corner of the room. Evelyn followed his gaze. A tall figure stood half hidden in the shadows by the window, his form a stark silhouette against the weak afternoon light. The Duke of Blackwood. He had not spoken a word since she had entered, had not even offered a nod of greeting. He was merely an observer at the dismantling of her life. His stillness was unnerving. It was absolute, like that of a predator waiting for its prey to make a fatal error. She could feel his scrutiny, a palpable pressure that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the solicitor whose face was slick with a nervous perspiration. Mr. Croft shuffled the papers before him. "Lady Evelyn," he began, his voice a dry rasp, "we are gathered today to discuss the betrothal contract arranged between your father, Baron Hayes, and my client, His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood." Evelyn inclined her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gloves were worn at the fingertips, a small, humiliating detail she tried to hide. "His Grace," the solicitor continued, stumbling over the words, "has reconsidered the arrangement. He wishes to dissolve the contract." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Evelyn's heart gave a painful lurch, a complex mix of relief and stinging humiliation. So she was not even suitable to be a purchased bride. The great Duke had inspected the merchandise and found it wanting. She felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, a familiar shame that had been her constant companion for years. "I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the only sound she could manage, the only thing that would not betray the tremor in her soul. Mr. Croft seemed to take her quietness for distress. He leaned forward, his expression meant to be reassuring but coming across as merely pitying. "His Grace is not an ungenerous man. He understands that this change of circumstances is an inconvenience. He is prepared to offer significant compensation for any emotional distress, or damage to your reputation. He pushed a document across the desk. It was a settlement. Her gaze scanned the page, seeing figures that made her breath catch. A country estate, a staggering yearly allowance, enough money to restore her father's fortunes 10 times over. It was a king's ransom, offered to her in exchange for her silence and her quiet disappearance from the Duke's life. She looked from the paper to the silent figure by the window. He had not moved. He was buying her off, just as her father had tried to sell her. She was a commodity, her value calculated and written down on a piece of paper. The relief she had felt moments before curdled into a cold, hard knot of anger in her chest. This was the ultimate insult. He did not even see her as a person, but as a problem that could be solved with coin. He assumed she had a price. Everyone did. Her father had a price. Society had a price. Why should the overlooked daughter of a bankrupt baron be any different? A strange calm settled over her. For the first time in her life, she felt a flicker of power. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but it was hers. She had one thing left that was not for sale: her dignity. She placed her hands flat on the desk, her fingers pressing into the cool, smooth wood. She looked directly at Mr. Croft, but her words were aimed at the shadow in the corner. "Give her whatever she asks, and get her out," the Duke had likely ordered. She could picture the cold dismissal in his voice. "Lady Evelyn," the solicitor prompted, misinterpreting her silence. "You will find the terms are more than generous. You may name any addition you wish." Evelyn drew a slow, steadying breath. She pushed the contract back across the desk, the paper whispering against the polished surface. "I require no compensation, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and firm, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The solicitor blinked, his mouth falling slightly agape. I beg your pardon?" "The dissolution of the contract is compensation enough," she stated. "I ask for nothing. I need nothing from His Grace." She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She gave a small, correct nod to the solicitor. Then, without a single glance toward the Duke, she turned to leave. She had taken 2 steps toward the door when a deep voice cut through the silence of the room, stopping her as effectively as a physical barrier. "Wait." The word was not loud, but it held an undeniable authority. It vibrated in the air, sharp and commanding. Evelyn froze, her back to him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She had not expected this. She had expected to walk away, to disappear back into the grayness, leaving them all behind. Slowly, she turned. The Duke of Blackwood had stepped out of the shadows. For the first time, she saw him clearly. He was younger than she had imagined, though his face was severe, carved from granite. His eyes, a startlingly dark blue, were fixed on her, narrowed in an expression she could not decipher. It was not anger, not yet. It was something else, a sharp, assessing curiosity. He had paid off 3 women before her. She was the first one who did not want his money. He seemed to be processing this fact, turning it over in his mind like a strange and unfamiliar object. "You ask for nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question so much as a statement of disbelief. "I have no need of your money, Your Grace," Evelyn replied, lifting her chin. She met his intense gaze, refusing to be intimidated. In this moment, in this room, she had nothing left to lose. He took a step closer, and Mr. Croft seemed to shrink in his chair. The Duke's presence filled the room, electric and overwhelming. "Every person has a need for money, Lady Evelyn, especially those in your circumstances." The veiled reference to her family's poverty was a deliberate barb, designed to remind her of her place. But the anger that had taken root in her only solidified. "Perhaps," she said coolly, but my dignity is not for sale. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even a grudging respect, passed through his dark eyes before his expression became shuttered once more. He studied her for a long, silent moment. The air crackled with a tension that was entirely different from before. It was no longer the cold tension of a business transaction, but something personal, something volatile. "Your father will not be pleased," he stated, his tone flat. "My father's pleasure is not my primary concern at this moment," she retorted, surprising herself with her own boldness. The corner of his mouth twitched, a barely perceptible movement. "Mr. Croft, you may leave us," the Duke commanded, without taking his eyes off her. The solicitor scrambled to his feet, gathering his papers with clumsy haste. "Your Grace," he stammered, bowing his way out of the room. The click of the door shutting behind him sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden, profound silence. They were alone. Evelyn's bravado began to waver. The reality of her situation settled upon her. She was an unmarried woman, unchaperoned, in a room with the most powerful and reputedly ruthless man in the country. A man whose betrothal she had just, in essence, thrown back in his face. "Why?" he asked, the single word sharp and direct. "Why what, Your Grace?" she asked, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "Why refuse the money? It would solve all your problems. It would save your father's estate. It would grant you a comfortable independence for the rest of your life. It is the logical choice." He spoke as if it were a puzzle, an equation that did not balance. "Because it is not a choice," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "It is a payment for my silence, for my complicity in being cast aside like an unwanted piece of furniture. I will not accept it." He tilted his head, his gaze unblinking. "You have an abundance of pride, Lady Evelyn." "It is all I have," she whispered, the admission costing her more than she would have thought. He was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was thoughtful, considering. He walked to the desk and picked up the rejected contract, his long fingers tracing the elegant script. He seemed to be looking for an answer in the ink, a clue to the woman who stood before him. "You misunderstand the offer," he said finally, his voice softer now, less abrasive. "It was not meant as an insult. It was meant to be a clean resolution. I have no wish to see you or your family ruined by this." "And yet, you were willing to let us believe the betrothal would proceed until this very day," she countered, a tremor of accusation in her voice. "You allowed my father to build his hopes, to make plans based on this union." For the first time, he looked away, his gaze shifting to the grey sky outside the window. "That was unavoidable. The timing was not of my choosing." He seemed to be speaking more to himself than to her. A strange thought occurred to Evelyn. He seemed almost as trapped by this situation as she was. He was a duke, a man who could command armies and influence kings, yet something about this betrothal had cornered him. "I will not leave you destitute," he said, turning back to her. His expression was resolute. "If you will not accept the settlement, I will find another way." "There is no need," she insisted. "I release you from the contract freely. That is all." "It is not all," he said, his voice firm. "Society will talk. Your reputation will suffer. You will be seen as the woman the Duke of Blackwood cast aside. No respectable man will have you after this." His words were blunt, but they were true. She had not allowed herself to think that far ahead. The humiliation of being publicly jilted would follow her forever. She would be a pariah, a subject of gossip and pity. "That is my concern, not yours," she said, though the words lacked their earlier conviction. A chill traced its way down her spine. "It is my concern now," he stated. "I caused this situation. I will see it rectified. Evelyn stared at him, bewildered. This was not the cold, unfeeling man of rumor. This was someone else entirely, someone complicated and driven by a code she did not understand. He was not dismissing her. He was engaging with her, arguing with her. He was treating her like a person, not a problem. "What do you propose?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her fear. He gestured to the chair she had vacated. "Sit, Lady Evelyn. It seems we have much to discuss." Hesitantly, she did as he asked. He did not return to the shadows, but took the chair Mr. Croft had occupied, placing him directly opposite her. The great mahogany desk was a battlefield between them, littered with the casualties of their failed betrothal. "I am a man of my word," he began, leaning forward slightly, his dark blue eyes capturing hers. "I promised your father a union that would secure his family. While I cannot proceed with the marriage, I will honor the spirit of the agreement." "By paying us off," she said, the bitterness returning to her tone. "No," he corrected her gently, "by ensuring your future. Tell me, what is it you truly want? Not what your father wants for you, not what society expects of you. What do you want, Evelyn?" He used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips was so unexpected it sent a jolt through her. No one had asked her that question before. Ever. Her wants had never been a consideration. They were a luxury she could not afford. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What did she want? A quiet life. A small cottage by the sea, perhaps. Her books, her charcoal pencils, a garden to tend. A life free from judgment and expectation. A life where she was not invisible, but simply at peace. It was a dream so foolish and unattainable that she had never dared to voice it. Tears pricked her eyes, and she looked down at her hands, mortified. She would not cry in front of him. She would not. "I see," he said softly, and to her astonishment, his voice was laced with something that sounded like empathy. "You want a life that is your own." She risked a glance at him. His face was no longer a cold mask. It was etched with a deep, weary sadness that seemed to sit uneasily with his power and position. In that moment, he looked profoundly lonely. "Allow me to provide that for you," he offered. "Not as a payoff, as an apology. A property, far from London, small, manageable, with a staff to see to your needs and an income sufficient to ensure you never have to depend on anyone again. No one need ever know it came from me. We can arrange it through Mr. Croft, a distant inheritance, a forgotten godmother. The world is full of such convenient fictions." It was everything she had ever dreamed of, handed to her on a silver platter by the very man she had expected to ruin her. It was a temptation so great it made her dizzy, but it was still his solution, his arrangement. She would still be living a life funded by his guilt. "Why?" she asked again, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this?" He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, as if the answer were written there. "Because I know what it is to be trapped in a life not of your own choosing," he said, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "And I will not be the cause of it for another." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Another. He had said another. This was not just about him changing his mind. This was about something deeper, something that had happened before. This was the source of his desperation, the reason for his cold reputation. The air in the room shifted again. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a confession, veiled and incomplete, but a confession nonetheless. She was no longer just the jilted bride. She was a witness to a crack in the Duke's impenetrable armor. Her curiosity bloomed into a driving need to understand. Who was this man? What had happened to him that would make him go to such extraordinary lengths to avoid a marriage, only to then take such extraordinary care of the woman he had rejected? "I accept your offer, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. "On one condition." His eyebrows rose in surprise. He had clearly expected her to either refuse again out of pride or accept with grateful tears. He had not expected a counter-offer. "Name it." "I wish to oversee the arrangements myself," she said. "I will choose the property. I will determine the allowance. I will not have it decided for me. I want to be a partner in this arrangement, not a recipient of your charity." He stared at her, a slow, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been. The sight of it made her breath catch in her throat. "Very well, Lady Evelyn," he said, the smile lingering in his eyes. "A partnership it is." Over the next few weeks, Evelyn found herself in the most surreal situation of her life. Twice a week, she would meet with the Duke of Blackwood to review properties and discuss financial arrangements. They met not in the stuffy solicitor's office, but in the vast, silent library of his London townhouse. The library was his sanctuary, a place of towering shelves filled with leather-bound books that smelled of knowledge and time. It was a quiet, comfortable space that seemed at odds with his formidable reputation. Here, surrounded by the words of poets and philosophers, he was different. He was less the Duke and more Alistair. He insisted she call him by his given name during their meetings. "We are partners, are we not?" he had said, a hint of wry amusement in his voice. It would be absurd to stand on ceremony. Evelyn, in turn, became more than Lady Evelyn, the overlooked wallflower. In his presence, she found a confidence she never knew she possessed. She argued with him about the merits of a coastal cottage versus a country manor. She debated architectural styles and the proper allocation of funds for a garden. He listened to her opinions with a serious attention no one had ever afforded her before. She discovered he was possessed of a sharp, dry wit. She learned that he had a passion for cartography, his library containing a priceless collection of ancient maps. He showed them to her one afternoon, his usual reserve falling away as he traced the faded coastlines of forgotten lands with a careful finger. His voice was filled with a quiet longing, the sound of a man who dreamed of escape. In these moments, she would forget he was the man who had intended to cast her aside. She would see only the lonely soul who hid behind a title, a man as trapped as she had been. One afternoon, while they were poring over the plans for a small estate in Devonshire, he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You are not what I expected, Evelyn," he said quietly. Her heart gave a little flutter. "Nor are you, Alistair." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had both misjudged the other. He had expected a grasping, vapid socialite. She had expected a cold, arrogant tyrant. They had both been wrong. The arrangement was nearly finalized. A beautiful cottage overlooking the sea had been chosen. The funds were being transferred. Her new life was about to begin. A part of her was thrilled, giddy with the prospect of freedom, but another, smaller part felt a strange and unwelcome pang of melancholy. Their meetings would end. She would leave for Devonshire, and he would remain in London. The strange, fragile connection they had forged would be severed. Their last scheduled meeting arrived on a dreary, rain-swept afternoon. The library was dark, the fire in the hearth casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alistair was more subdued than usual, his movements stiff, his expression guarded once more. The easy camaraderie of their previous meetings had vanished, replaced by a formal distance. "Everything is in order," he said, his voice clipped as he gestured to a final stack of papers on the table between them. "The deed is in your name. The accounts have been established. You are free." The word should have sounded like a victory. Instead, it fell like a stone into a frozen pond. Free. Free from him. "Thank you, Alistair," she said, her voice small. "For everything." "It was the least I could do," he replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. He would not look at her. The silence stretched, thick and awkward. This was it. This was the end. She should stand up, thank him one last time, and walk out of his life forever. But her feet felt as if they were nailed to the floor. "Will you be happy, do you think?" he asked suddenly, his voice rough. The question surprised her. I hope so," she stammered. "It is all I have ever wanted. A quiet life." "Quiet can be lonely," he said, the words heavy with a personal truth that was painful to hear. Impulsively, she reached across the table, her hand hovering for a moment before she dared to touch his. His skin was cool, his fingers long and strong. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. His head snapped up, his dark blue eyes wide with surprise, meeting hers. "Why did you really do it, Alistair?" she whispered, the question she had been holding back for weeks. "Why were you so desperate to avoid marrying me? It was more than just a disinclination. I saw it in your eyes that first day. It was fear." His expression shuttered completely. He withdrew his hand from hers as if her touch had burned him. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to her, a familiar silhouette against the grey, weeping sky. "It is not your concern," he said, his voice cold and final. The Duke was back, the walls firmly in place. Evelyn's heart sank. She had overstepped. She had mistaken their friendly partnership for something more, for a level of intimacy he was unwilling to grant. She had been a fool. She stood, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "You are right. Forgive me. I will take my leave." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her once again. "Do not go," he said, the words torn from him. He sounded anguished. She waited, her hand on the back of her chair, her heart pounding. He turned from the window, and the look on his face stole her breath. The mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, naked vulnerability that was shocking to behold. His eyes were haunted, filled with a pain so profound it seemed to emanate from him in waves. "I am doing this because I made a vow," he said, his voice cracking. "I vowed I would never again chain a woman to my name. I would never again be responsible for the slow withering of a soul in a loveless marriage." He gestured for her to follow him. He led her from the library, through a long, silent corridor to a part of the house she had never seen. He stopped before a set of ornate double doors and pushed them open. It was a sitting room, exquisitely decorated in pale blues and creams. It was a fiercely feminine space, but it was pristine, unused. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, and the air was stale, untouched by time. On an easel near the window sat a canvas, draped in a white sheet. "This was her room," he said, his voice hollow. "My first wife, Lady Isabel." Evelyn felt a sudden chill. He had been married before. No one ever spoke of it. It was a forgotten piece of his history. "It was an arranged marriage, much like ours was to be," he continued, his gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. "She was beautiful, gentle. She loved to paint. She tried so hard to be the perfect Duchess. But she was desperately unhappy. I was young, arrogant. I saw my duty, but I did not see her. I gave her everything she could ever want, except the one thing she needed." "What was that?" Evelyn whispered. "A choice," he said, his voice breaking. "Freedom. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and I was her keeper, I watched the light go out of her eyes, day by day. I did nothing. I told myself it was her duty to adapt. I was a fool. He walked to the easel and slowly pulled away the dust sheet. It was a portrait, unfinished. A self-portrait. The woman on the canvas had a face of heartbreaking beauty and eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to swallow the light. It was the face of a prisoner. One night, she walked into the gardens and never came back, Alastair said, his voice thick with unshed tears. She drowned herself in the ornamental lake. She left a note. It said only one word: forgive. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sheer tragedy of it was overwhelming. I have lived with that word every day for 10 years, he said, his broad shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. I failed her. The title, the wealth, the duty. It all killed her. I vowed then that I would never marry again. I would never put another woman in that position. But my family, the crown, they insist. They demand an heir. They have forced these betrothals on me one after another. I have always found a way out. I have paid them to walk away, to save themselves from me. He finally looked at her, his eyes swimming with a decade of grief and self-loathing. When you refused my money, you were the first one who did not play the game. You looked at me not as a duke, but as a man. You demanded your dignity. You reminded me of the strength she never had the chance to find. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding in the dusty, silent room. All his coldness, his ruthlessness, his distance, it was all a shield, a penance. He was not a monster. He was a man haunted by a ghost, terrified of repeating his gravest mistake. Evelyn's heart ached for him, not with pity, but with a profound, soul-deep empathy. She knew what it was to feel trapped, to feel your own light dimming under the weight of expectation. She saw his pain, and it mirrored a smaller, quieter version of her own. She stepped toward him, closing the distance between them. She did not touch him. She simply stood before him, a silent offering of presence, of understanding. "It was not your fault, Alastair," she said softly. "It was the cage that was at fault, not the keeper." A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his granite cheek. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not the Duke of Blackwood, but a man who was drowning. In that moment she had a choice. Her cottage by the sea was waiting. Her freedom, her quiet, lonely peace was signed and sealed. She could walk away from this man and his grief, and no one would blame her. She could take the life he had so carefully constructed for her and leave him to his ghosts. Or she could stay. She thought of the lonely library, the passion in his voice when he spoke of maps. She thought of his wry smile, the surprising gentleness in his eyes. She thought of the man who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else ever had. The cottage by the sea felt like a surrender. It was the safe choice, the lonely choice. Staying was terrifying. It was a leap into an unknown storm. But, for the first time in her life, Evelyn did not want to be safe. She wanted to be brave. "You are wrong about one thing," she said, her voice finding a strength she did not know it possessed. He looked at her, his expression questioning. "You said you gave Isabel everything but a choice. You have given me one, and I am making it." He frowned, confused. "You have chosen your cottage, your freedom." "No," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That was the life I wanted when I had no other options. That was the dream of a prisoner. But I am not a prisoner anymore." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am choosing to stay." His eyes widened, a storm of disbelief and hope warring in their depths. "Stay? Here? Why? There is nothing for you here but a haunted man and a tarnished name. I am not staying for the Duke of Blackwood, she said, her voice softening. I am staying for Alistair, the man who loves maps, the man who hides in libraries, the man who carries a burden too heavy to bear alone. She finally reached out, her fingers gently brushing the tear track on his cheek. His skin was warm. He was real. This was real. Let me help you carry it, she whispered. He stared at her, his composure shattering completely. He let out a choked sob, a sound of such profound, wrenching relief that it broke her heart. He reached for her, his hands framing her face as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. Evelyn, he breathed, his forehead coming to rest against hers. You do not know what you are asking. I know, she replied, her own tears beginning to fall. I am asking for a life, a real one, with you. He did not say anything more. He simply lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation and gratitude. It was gentle, hesitant, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt and sorrow, but underneath it all, there was the unmistakable flavor of hope. It was the first true kiss of her life, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that it would not be her last. A year later, the great London townhouse of the Duke of Blackwood was no longer silent. The dusty sheets had been removed from Isabel's sitting room. Evelyn had not erased the memory of the first Duchess. Instead, she had honored it. She had filled the room with light and air, and on the easel, next to the unfinished self-portrait, she had placed one of her own charcoal sketches, a view of the sea from a cottage in Devonshire, a reminder of a choice made. Laughter now echoed in the long corridors, a sound that had been absent for more than a decade. The library was no longer a sanctuary for a lonely man, but a shared space where Evelyn would read aloud as Alistair planned new gardens for their country estate. He was still quiet, still reserved in public, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. It had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace that only she could see. He had not been magically cured of his grief. The ghosts of the past still whispered in the dark hours of the night. But now, he did not face them alone. Evelyn was there, a steady, warm presence in the darkness, a hand to hold, a quiet voice to remind him that the dawn would come. Their marriage was not the stuff of fairy tales. It was something quieter, deeper, and more real. It was a partnership, forged in truth and built on the foundations of a shared understanding of pain. They had not fallen in love in a ballroom. They had found it in a dusty room, amidst the wreckage of the past. One crisp autumn afternoon, Evelyn sat on a bench in the newly revitalized gardens. Alistair came to sit beside her, handing her a cup of warm tea. He did not speak, simply taking her hand in his, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, comfortable gesture. Do you ever regret it? He asked, softly, looking out over the vibrant chrysanthemums. The cottage by the sea. Evelyn smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. The rough tweed of his coat was a comforting anchor. Never, she said. A person can feel just as free in a castle as they can in a cottage, as long as they have the key to their own door. He turned his head, his lips brushing her hair. And do you? He asked. Do you have the key? She lifted her head and looked into his dark blue eyes that now held not shadows, but a reflection of her own love. We built a new door, she said, and we hold the key together. True freedom, she had learned, was not about a place. It was about a choice. It was the choice to face the ghosts of the past, the choice to build a new future, and the choice to love a man not for his title, but for the beautiful, broken heart he had been brave enough to show her. It was a choice she would make again, every single day, for the rest of her life.